The notification popped up on my phone at exactly 7:47 a.m. Reminder, Rachel's engagement party, tonight, 6 p.m. I stared at the screen, watching the words blur slightly as my coffee grew cold in my hands. 3 years. It had been 3 years since I'd seen most of these people. 3 years since I'd walked away from everything they thought defined success. And 3 years since anyone in my family had bothered to ask what I was actually doing with my life. I should have been excited. Rachel was my younger sister, and despite everything, I loved her. But the knot in my stomach told a different story. These gatherings had a way of making me feel like I was still that awkward college graduate who couldn't figure out her next move, even though that version of me had disappeared long ago. The problem was, nobody seemed to notice she was gone. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from my mother. "Emma, please dress appropriately tonight. Rachel's fiancé's family will be there, and you know how important first impressions are." I almost laughed. After 32 years, she still felt the need to remind me how to exist in public. The irony wasn't lost on me that while she worried about my appearance, I'd spent the morning reviewing contracts worth more than most people's annual salaries. I set the phone down and walked to my window, looking out over the Denver skyline. My apartment wasn't flashy by any means. Clean lines, neutral colors, and furniture that served its purpose without screaming for attention. But the view was mine, paid for by work that most of my family didn't understand and definitely didn't respect. They saw my quiet life as a failure to launch, not as a deliberate choice to build something meaningful on my own terms. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, embossed with gold lettering that seemed to mock my simple lifestyle. Join us for an evening of celebration as Rachel and Trevor announced their engagement. I'd held it in my hands, feeling the weight of obligation and dreading the inevitable conversations. Where was I working now? Was I still doing that computer thing? Had I met anyone special? The questions always came with a tone that suggested my answers would be insufficient, no matter what I said. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The venue was exactly what I'd expected. The Pinnacle Club, perched on the 40th floor of downtown Denver's most prestigious building, with floor-to-ceiling windows and servers who moved like dancers between tables draped in white linen. Rachel had always loved grand gestures, and Trevor, from what I'd gathered, had the family money to make them happen. The guest list was a carefully curated mix of college friends, family members, and what my mother called important connections. I arrived fashionably on time, which in my family meant I was early. The elevator ride felt endless, each floor marking another layer of anxiety building in my chest. When the doors finally opened, I was greeted by the sound of champagne glasses clinking and the kind of laughter that fills expensive spaces. Rachel spotted me immediately, her smile bright and genuine as she rushed over in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Emma, you made it!" She pulled me into a hug that smelled like designer perfume and happiness. "You look great. I love what you've done with your hair." I touched my hair self-consciously. I'd had it cut shorter last month, a practical decision that apparently registered as a style choice to her. "Come on, let me introduce you to everyone." The first hour passed in a blur of introductions to people whose names I'd forget by morning, and conversations that felt like job interviews disguised as small talk. Trevor's family was exactly what I'd imagined. His mother, Patricia, had the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes, and a handshake that felt like she was evaluating my worth in real time. His father talked in numbers, stock prices, and property values, the kind of man who measured success by the size of someone's portfolio. "And what do you do, Emma?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying the subtle edge of someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth much attention. The question I'd been dreading hung in the air between us like a challenge. "I work in consulting," I replied. keeping my answer deliberately vague. It was true, technically, though it barely scratched the surface of what I actually did. "Oh, how interesting," she said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "What kind of consulting?" Before I could answer, my cousin Brian appeared at my elbow, a little too close and smelling like he'd been sampling the bar's whiskey selection. "Emma does computer stuff," he announced to the small group that had gathered around us. "You know, websites and things. Very modern." The dismissal in his voice was casual but sharp. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. Brian had always been the family's golden child, the one who'd married young, bought a house in the suburbs, and checked all the boxes our parents had laid out for success. He'd also been the one to suggest, loudly and in front of everyone at last year's Christmas dinner, that maybe it was time for me to get serious about my career. "Actually," I started, but Trevor's father cut me off with a wave of his hand. "The tech sector is fascinating," he said, though his tone suggested he found it about as fascinating as watching paint dry. "We've been looking at some investments in that space. Mostly small startups, you understand. Nothing too risky." He chuckled, and the others joined in, as if the idea of risk in business was something only amateurs concerned themselves with. I nodded and smiled, letting the conversation flow around me like water. They talked about market trends they'd read about in magazines, investment strategies they'd heard on podcasts, and opportunities they were considering with the casual confidence of people who'd never actually built anything from scratch. I sipped my wine and watched, noting how quickly they moved from dismissing my work to discussing the very industry I'd spent years mastering. Rachel appeared again, this time with her maid of honor, Jessica, who I remembered from college as the kind of person who treated friendships like networking opportunities. Jessica had become a real estate agent, the kind who posed with house keys in her social media photos and called herself an entrepreneur. "Emma!" Jessica exclaimed, her voice pitched high with artificial enthusiasm. Rachel was just telling me about your little computer business. "That's so brave of you, working from home like that. I could never do it. I need the structure of an office, you know? The networking opportunities, the daily interactions with successful people." The word little hung in the air like a judgment. I felt the familiar sting of being diminished, of having my work reduced to something quaint and manageable. But I'd learned over the years that corrections often made things worse, turning dismissal into pity, or worse, defensive explanations that made me sound like I was trying to prove something. "It works for me," I said simply, taking another sip of wine. "Oh, I'm sure it does," Jessica continued, her smile never wavering. "And there's nothing wrong with keeping things small, you know? Not everyone needs to conquer the world. Some people are perfectly happy with their little corner of it." The conversation continued around me, but I found myself drifting, observing the room with the kind of detached clarity that comes from feeling like an outsider. These people weren't malicious, not really. They were just comfortable in their assumptions, secure in their understanding of how the world worked and where everyone fit within it. They'd labeled me years ago, and nothing I said tonight would change that label. My mother appeared at my side, her hand landing gently on my arm in a gesture that might have looked supportive to anyone watching, but felt more like a reminder to behave. "Emma, dear, have you met the Hartmans? They own that lovely boutique hotel chain we stayed at last summer." The Hartmans were a couple in their 60s, impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of quiet wealth that doesn't need to announce itself. They greeted me with polite interest, the kind reserved for family members of people they actually cared about knowing. "Your daughter works in technology," my mother explained, as if I weren't standing right there. "She's very independent, always has been. Even as a child, she preferred to do things her own way." I recognized the tone. It was the same one she used when she talked about my father's eccentric brother, who'd never married, or my cousin who'd become a traveling photographer instead of a lawyer. Fond but concerned, proud but worried, loving but disappointed. "Technology is certainly the future," Mrs. Hartman said kindly. "Our grandson is studying computer science at Stanford. Perhaps you two should connect. It's always good to have mentors in the field." The assumption that I would be the mentor, not the one being mentored, should have been insulting. But it was so casually delivered that I almost admired its efficiency. In one sentence, she'd managed to position me as both relevant enough to be useful and junior enough to be dismissed. The evening continued in this vein, a carefully choreographed dance of polite conversation and subtle diminishment. I watched Trevor's family assess each guest, filing them away into categories of usefulness and importance. I watched my own family navigate the social hierarchy, eager to prove their worth to people who would forget their names by morning. And I watched Rachel, glowing with happiness and completely oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around her. Engagement party. By the time the speeches began, I'd found refuge at a table near the back, surrounded by other family members who'd been deemed less essential to the evening's success. My Uncle David, who managed a small accounting firm, sat to my left, making quiet observations about the cost of the venue. My cousin Sarah, a teacher who'd been apologizing for her profession all evening, sat across from me, checking her phone more frequently as the night wore on. Trevor's father stood to give the first toast, his voice carrying easily across the room as he welcomed Rachel into their family and spoke about the importance of building something lasting together. The irony wasn't lost on me that while he talked about building, I was the only person in the room who'd actually built something from nothing. And yet I was sitting at the table reserved for people who didn't matter. Rachel's speech was next, heartfelt and genuine, full of gratitude for the people who'd supported her, and excitement for the future she was building with Trevor. When she mentioned family, her eyes found mine across the room, and she smiled. The kind of smile that reminded me why I'd driven across town in traffic to be here despite my reservations. The final speech came from Trevor himself, confident and polished, talking about success and partnership and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who shared your values and ambitions. As he spoke, I found myself thinking about the conversations I'd had throughout the evening, the casual dismissals and well-meaning condescension, the way my work had been reduced to a hobby and my choices framed as limitations. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, I found myself saying goodbye to the same people who'd spent the night categorizing me as harmless and irrelevant. They hugged me warmly, told me it was wonderful to see me, and promised to stay in touch in the way that people do when they have no intention of following through. Patricia took my hand in both of hers as she prepared to leave, her expression softening into something that might have been maternal if it hadn't felt so practiced. "It was lovely meeting you, Emma. I hope you'll find your path soon. Everyone deserves to find their place in the world." I smiled and thanked her, biting back the response that sat on the tip of my tongue. I had found my path. I'd built my place in the world, brick by brick, decision by decision, failure by failure, until I'd created something that was entirely mine. The fact that she couldn't see it didn't make it less real. The drive home was quiet, the Denver streets empty, except for the occasional late-night wanderer. I replayed the evening in my mind, not with anger, but with a kind of sad clarity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. These people weren't trying to hurt me. They were simply operating from a worldview that had no room for paths that didn't look like theirs, for success that didn't announce itself with the right titles and office addresses. But as I pulled into my parking spot and looked up at my building, I felt something shift inside me. For 3 years, I'd been content to let them think what they wanted, to fly under the radar and avoid the complications that came with correcting people's assumptions. But tonight had reminded me of the cost of that invisibility, the way it allowed people to dismiss not just my work, but my worth. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, my heels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. Tomorrow, I decided, things would be different. Not because I needed their approval or recognition, but because I was tired of being a ghost in my own story. I opened my laptop and pulled up the email I'd been avoiding for weeks, the one from the Denver Business Journal asking if I'd be willing to participate in their annual feature on young entrepreneurs who were reshaping the local economy. I'd been putting it off, telling myself I was too busy, that I didn't need the attention, that my work spoke for itself. But as I began typing my response, I realized that maybe it was time for my work to speak a little louder. Not for them, but for me. And maybe, just maybe, for the other quiet builders who were tired of being overlooked at their own family gatherings. The cursor blinked on the screen, waiting for my decision. I took a deep breath and began to type. The email confirmation arrived at 6:23 a.m., 3 days after Rachel's engagement party. Thank you for accepting our interview request. We look forward to featuring you in our upcoming series on Denver's rising entrepreneurs. I stared at the message, feeling a mixture of anticipation and something that might have been relief. After years of existing in the shadows of other people's assumptions, the idea of stepping into the light felt both terrifying and overdue. I closed the laptop and walked to my kitchen, the morning routine providing a familiar anchor as my mind wandered to the work that had brought me to this moment. 5 years ago, I'd walked away from a corporate consulting job that was slowly suffocating my creativity and sense of purpose. The pay had been decent, the benefits solid, and the trajectory predictable. But every morning felt like putting on a costume that didn't quite fit. The decision to leave hadn't been dramatic or sudden. There was no explosive resignation or bridge burning, confrontation. I'd simply realized one Tuesday morning that I was spending my days solving other people's problems while ignoring my own growing dissatisfaction. I'd given my 2 weeks' notice, cleaned out my desk, and started building something that felt authentic to who I was rather than who I thought I should be. What came next was a company that didn't exist in any traditional sense. No corner office, no employees wearing matching polo shirts, no mission statement framed on a wall. Instead, I'd built something fluid and responsive, a consulting practice that specialized in helping mid-sized companies navigate digital transformations without losing their organizational soul. I worked with businesses that were too big for basic solutions but too small for the massive consulting firms that charged astronomical fees for cookie-cutter approaches. The work was complicated, requiring technical expertise, strategic thinking, and the kind of emotional intelligence that came from understanding how people actually behaved when their familiar systems started changing. I helped companies transition from paper-based processes to digital workflows, from isolated departments to integrated teams, from reactive business models to proactive ones that could adapt and grow. My first client had been a family-owned manufacturing company in Colorado Springs that was drowning in inefficient processes and outdated technology. The owner, Maria Santos, had hired me not because she understood exactly what I did, but because she was desperate and I was affordable. Over 6 months, we'd rebuilt their entire operational framework, creating systems that saved them 40 hours of work per week and increased their output by 30%. Word traveled in the quiet way. That good work tends to spread. Maria recommended me to her supplier, who mentioned me to his distributor, who brought me in to help with an inventory management crisis that was costing them thousands of dollars monthly. Each project led to another, and slowly, steadily, I'd built a reputation among people who valued results over rhetoric. The work was invisible to most people because it happened behind the scenes, in the operational foundations that made businesses run smoothly rather than the flashy innovations that made headlines. I wasn't developing apps or launching startups. That would be featured in tech magazines. I was solving practical problems for real companies with real challenges, and that kind of work rarely came with public recognition or impressive titles. My clients didn't always understand the technical details of what I did, but they understood the results. Sarah Kim, who owned a small chain of boutique hotels, had hired me to help streamline her booking and customer service processes. After our work together, her staff spent 60% less time on administrative tasks, and her customer satisfaction scores increased by 45%. She'd recommended me to 3 other business owners in her industry network, none of whom cared about my educational background or office location as long as I could deliver similar results. The financial success had come gradually, building month by month as my client base expanded and my rates increased to reflect the value I was providing. By the end of my 3rd year, I was earning more than I'd ever made in corporate consulting, with the added benefits of choosing my own projects and working with people who genuinely appreciated what I brought to their businesses. But success, in my world, didn't translate easily to success in my family's world. When people asked what I did for work, I couldn't point to a recognizable company name or impressive job title. When they asked where my office was, I had to explain that I worked from home, which immediately triggered assumptions about the scale and legitimacy of my work. When they asked about my team, I had to acknowledge that I worked primarily alone, which reinforced their belief that my business was small and somehow less significant than more traditional enterprises. The irony was that several of my clients were companies that people in my family would have recognized and respected, but confidentiality agreements prevented me from name-dropping or sharing details about the work I'd done for them. I'd helped a regional bank modernize their loan processing system, worked with a medical practice group to improve their patient management workflow, and consulted for a construction company that was struggling to coordinate projects across multiple locations. These weren't small organizations or trivial problems, but I couldn't use them to validate my work in the social settings where validation seemed to matter most. The isolation of working alone had been challenging at first, but I'd grown to appreciate the clarity it provided. Without the distractions of office politics or unnecessary meetings, I could focus entirely on the problems I was being paid to solve. My days had a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than frantic, productive rather than performative. Most mornings I started with coffee and email, responding to client questions and reviewing progress on current projects. The afternoon was typically reserved for deep work, the kind of analytical thinking that required uninterrupted focus and couldn't be squeezed between meetings. Evenings were for planning and strategic thinking, looking ahead to identify potential challenges or opportunities in upcoming projects. The work itself was intellectually satisfying in a way that my previous job had never been. Instead of applying generic solutions to specific problems, I was creating customized approaches that reflected each client's unique situation and goals. Every project required me to learn something new, whether it was understanding the particular challenges of inventory management in the restaurant industry, or figuring out how to improve communication between field teams and office staff in a service-based business. My apartment had gradually transformed into a workspace that reflected this approach. The dining room table had become a project planning area where I could spread out client materials and create visual maps of their current processes and proposed improvements. A corner of the living room housed a standing desk where I did most of my computer work, positioned to take advantage of the natural light and city view that helped me think clearly during long stretches of analysis and problem-solving. The financial freedom that came with building a successful consulting practice had allowed me to make choices based on what felt right, rather than what was expected or necessary. I drove a reliable but unremarkable car because I valued dependability over status. I lived in a comfortable but modest apartment because I preferred to invest my money rather than spend it on impressive living spaces that existed primarily to impress other people. These choices had created a lifestyle that was stable and fulfilling, but also largely invisible to people who measured success through external markers. My family saw someone who worked from home in a job they didn't understand, who drove an older car and lived in a rental apartment, who didn't have traditional markers of professional achievement like corporate titles or prestigious company affiliations. The disconnect was particularly sharp during family gatherings, where conversations naturally turned to career updates and professional accomplishments. My cousins would share news about promotions and job changes, office relocations, and new responsibilities, the kind of updates that were easy to understand and celebrate. When the conversation turned to me, I struggled to translate my work into language that made sense in that context. How do you explain that you'd helped a struggling retail chain increase their profit margins by 18% through better inventory management? How do you describe the satisfaction of solving a complex workflow problem that had been frustrating a client's staff for months? How do you convey the value of work that happened behind the scenes, in the operational foundations that most people never thought about, but that determined whether businesses succeeded or failed? The answer I'd learned was that you often didn't. Instead, you smiled and offered vague descriptions that satisfied people's curiosity without challenging their assumptions about what meaningful work looked like. You accepted their well-intentioned advice about networking and professional development, their suggestions that you consider pursuing more traditional career paths, their gentle implications that maybe it was time to think about stability and long-term planning. But sitting in my kitchen that morning, reading the email confirmation from the Denver Business Journal, I felt something shifting in my approach to these conversations. The interview would be published in their monthly feature on local entrepreneurs who were building innovative businesses and contributing to the region's economic growth. My work would be described in detail, my client results highlighted, my approach to business development examined and explained. For the first time in 5 years, I would exist in a context where my work was understood and valued, where the results I'd achieved would be presented as accomplishments rather than curiosities. The article would include my photograph, my company, name, and detailed descriptions of the problems I solved and the value I created for clients. It would be public, searchable, and permanent in a way that dinner party conversations never were. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. I'd grown comfortable with invisibility, with flying under the radar and avoiding the complications that came with public recognition. But I was also tired of feeling like I had to apologize for my choices or downplay my achievements to make other people comfortable with their assumptions about what success should look like. I opened my laptop again and began preparing for the interview, reviewing client case studies and organizing the information I would need to articulate clearly what I'd built and why it mattered. The journalist would want specific examples, measurable results, and insights into the challenges and opportunities in my industry. I would need to be prepared to discuss not just what I did, but why it was significant and how it fit into larger trends in business and technology. The preparation process felt like putting together a portfolio of my professional identity, collecting evidence of work that had previously existed only in client files and private communications. I pulled together testimonials from satisfied clients, data showing the improvements I'd helped them achieve, and documentation of projects that had resulted in significant cost savings or operational improvements. As I worked through this material, I was struck by the cumulative impact of what I'd accomplished. Individual projects had felt incremental, solving specific problems for particular clients, but viewed together, they represented a substantial body of work that had genuinely improved how multiple businesses operated and served their customers. The manufacturing company in Colorado Springs was now processing orders 20% faster and had expanded their product line based on insights generated by the new systems I'd helped them implement. The boutique hotel chain had opened 2 new locations using operational frameworks I'd developed, and their customer retention rates had improved significantly. The medical practice group had reduced patient wait times and improved their scheduling efficiency to the point where they were considering expanding their services. These weren't abstract achievements or theoretical improvements. They were real changes that affected real people, employees who could do their jobs more effectively, customers who received better service, business owners who could focus on growth, rather than constantly firefighting operational problems. The interview was scheduled for the following Friday at a coffee shop downtown, a neutral location where I could speak candidly about my work without the distractions of my home office or the formality of a business setting. The journalist, Rebecca Chen, had specified that she was particularly interested in entrepreneurs who had built successful businesses outside of traditional startup ecosystems, people who were solving practical problems in innovative ways without venture capital funding or aspirations for explosive growth. Her interest in my approach felt validating in a way that family conversations never had. She understood that there were multiple paths to building a meaningful business, that success could be measured in client satisfaction and sustainable growth rather than just revenue numbers or employee counts. She wanted to explore the challenges and benefits of working independently, the skills required to build lasting client relationships, and the personal qualities that enabled someone to thrive in an uncertain and constantly evolving business environment. As the day of the interview approached, I found myself thinking differently about the work I'd been doing and the choices I'd made to build my business. Instead of focusing on what my approach lacked compared to more traditional career paths, I began to see the unique value in what I'd created. The flexibility to choose projects that aligned with my interests and values, the ability to develop deep expertise in areas that fascinated me, the satisfaction of building something entirely my own. The morning of the interview, I dressed carefully, but not obsessively, choosing clothes that felt professional but authentic to who I was rather than costume-like attempts to project an image I thought would be more impressive. I arrived at the coffee shop early, selected a quiet table with good lighting, and ordered coffee while I waited for Rebecca to arrive. When she walked in, I recognized her immediately from her author photo on the newspaper's website. She was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with an energy that suggested genuine curiosity about the stories she covered, rather than just professional obligation to fill column space. The conversation that followed was unlike any discussion I'd had about my work in years. Rebecca asked detailed questions about my client relationships, my approach to problem solving, and my perspective on the challenges facing small and mid-sized businesses in an increasingly complex technological landscape. She wanted to understand not just what I did, but how I thought about business, innovation, and the role of consulting in helping organizations adapt and thrive. I found myself talking openly about projects I'd never been able to discuss in family settings, describing complex challenges and innovative solutions in language that Rebecca understood and appreciated. She took notes throughout our conversation, occasionally asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she was really listening and thinking about the implications of what I was sharing. Near the end of our interview, she asked a question that surprised me with its directness. Do you feel like your work is understood and appreciated by the people in your personal life? I paused, considering how to answer honestly without sounding bitter or defensive. I think my family loves and supports me, I said finally, but they don't really understand what I do or why I chose to do it this way. They see independence as isolation and non-traditional success as not quite real success. Rebecca nodded, making a note. That's actually a common theme among the entrepreneurs I interview. There's often a disconnect between how society talks about supporting small business and innovation, and how individuals who choose non-traditional paths are actually treated by their families and social networks. The observation felt both validating and sad. I wasn't alone in feeling misunderstood, but that also meant there were others navigating similar challenges, building meaningful work while feeling invisible to the people who mattered most to them personally. As we finished our conversation, and Rebecca gathered her materials, she mentioned that the article would be published in the following month's edition, and would also be featured prominently on the newspaper's website. She expected it would generate significant interest, both from potential clients and from other entrepreneurs who were building similar businesses. Walking back to my car after the interview, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in months. For 2 hours, I'd been able to talk about my work with someone who understood its value and complexity, who asked intelligent questions and appreciated thoughtful answers. I'd been reminded that my perspective and experience had worth beyond their utility to my clients, that the path I'd chosen was valid and admirable rather than concerning or insufficient. The article would be published exactly 1 week before Rachel's wedding, where I would see many of the same people who had dismissed my work at the engagement party. I wondered if any of them read the Denver Business Journal, if they would recognize my name or make the connection between the entrepreneur featured in the newspaper and the family member they'd categorized as underachieving and directionless. But as I drove home through downtown Denver, I realized that their recognition was no longer the point. The interview had reminded me that my work had value and meaning independent of other people's ability to understand or appreciate it. I had built something significant and sustainable, created genuine value for clients, and developed expertise that was both rare and increasingly important in a rapidly changing business environment. Whether my family understood that or not was ultimately their choice and their limitation, not my problem to solve. The article went live on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after my interview with Rebecca Chen. I discovered it the way most people probably did, through a notification on my phone while I was reviewing quarterly reports for a client in Boulder. The headline read, "The Quiet Revolution: How Local Consultant Emma Rodriguez is Transforming Small Business Operations, One Company at a Time." I stared at my name in print, feeling a strange mixture of pride and vulnerability. There it was, my professional story laid out in detail for anyone to read, complete with client testimonials, specific project results, and a photograph of me looking more confident than I felt most days. The article was thorough, well-written, and positioned my work as part of a larger trend towards specialized independent consulting that was helping regional businesses compete more effectively in an increasingly complex marketplace. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. Text messages from clients who had seen the article and wanted to congratulate me, emails from potential new clients who had found my contact information through the newspaper's website, and a voice message from my accountant reminding me that this kind of publicity might require some adjustments to my business structure and tax planning. But the response that surprised me most was silence from my family. The article had been online for 6 hours, shared on social media multiple times, and featured prominently on the Denver Business Journal's homepage. But my phone hadn't buzzed, once with a message from my mother, my sister, or any of my cousins. Either they hadn't seen it, or they had seen it and weren't sure how to respond. I decided not to think about it too much. The article had achieved exactly what I'd hoped it would, creating visibility for my work and attracting interest from businesses that could benefit from my services. Over the next few days, I fielded calls from 3 potential clients, scheduled consultations with 2 others, and received an invitation to speak at a regional business development conference in the fall. The momentum felt good, like validation that I'd been building something worthwhile, even when it felt invisible to the people around me. I threw myself into the new projects, working with a restaurant group that was struggling to coordinate inventory across multiple locations and helping a small law firm streamline their client intake process to reduce administrative overhead. The work was exactly the kind of challenge I loved, complex enough to require creative thinking, but practical enough to generate measurable results. The restaurant group was losing thousands of dollars monthly due to food waste and inefficient ordering processes. The law firm was spending so much time on paperwork that they were turning away potential clients because they didn't have capacity to take on new cases. These weren't glamorous problems, but they were real ones, and solving them would have immediate, tangible impacts on people's livelihoods and professional satisfaction. I spent long days analyzing their current processes, interviewing staff members to understand pain points and bottlenecks, and designing new workflows that would eliminate inefficiencies without disrupting the aspects of their operations that were working well. The restaurant project was particularly satisfying because it required coordinating with vendors, kitchen staff, and management across 5 different locations. I had to understand not just the technical aspects of inventory management, but the human dynamics that determined whether new processes would actually be adopted and sustained over time. After 3 weeks of analysis and system design, we implemented a coordinated ordering system that reduced food waste by 35% and freed up approximately 15 hours per week of management time. that could be redirected toward customer service and staff development. The owner, Marcus Williams, was so pleased with the results that he recommended me to 2 other restaurant owners in his network. The law firm project presented different challenges, but equally rewarding. Outcomes: the partners had built a successful practice over 20 years, but their growth had outpaced their administrative systems, creating bottlenecks that were frustrating both staff and clients. We redesigned their intake process, implemented document management systems that reduced time spent searching for files, and created workflows that allowed paralegals to handle routine tasks more efficiently. The changes resulted in a 40% reduction in the time required to onboard new clients and a 25% increase in the firm's capacity to take on additional cases without hiring new staff. More importantly, the attorneys were able to spend more time on legal work and less time on administrative tasks, which improved both their job satisfaction and the quality of service they could provide to clients. These projects reminded me why I'd chosen this path in the first place. The work was intellectually stimulating, personally meaningful, and financially rewarding in ways that my previous corporate job had never been. I was solving real problems, for real people, and the improvements I helped implement had lasting impacts that extended far beyond our immediate consulting relationship. But even as my professional life gained momentum and recognition, my personal relationships remained, stuck in old patterns of assumption and misunderstanding. Rachel's wedding was approaching, and the family dynamics I'd experienced at her engagement party showed no signs of shifting, despite the very public validation of my work that had appeared in the city's primary business publication. My mother called on a Saturday morning, ostensibly to discuss wedding logistics, but really to express concern about my +1 status. "Emma, honey, I know you've been focused on your work, but Rachel really hopes you'll bring someone to the wedding. It's such a romantic celebration, and she'd love for you to share that with someone special." The implication was clear. Despite building a successful business that had been featured in major local media, I was still being evaluated primarily through the lens of traditional relationship milestones. My professional achievements were interesting, perhaps, but they didn't address the fundamental concern about my personal life that seemed to worry my family more than my career trajectory. "I'm planning to come alone, Mom," I said, keeping my tone light. "I'm looking forward to celebrating Rachel and Trevor, and I don't need a date to enjoy the wedding." "Of course, dear," she replied, but I could hear the disappointment in her voice. "It's just that everyone else will be coupled up, and I don't want you to feel left out." The conversation continued in this vein for another 10 minutes, with my mother offering to set me up with various single men in her social network, all of whom sounded perfectly nice, but none of whom had any particular connection to my interests or lifestyle. I listened patiently, made appropriate responses, and eventually managed to redirect the conversation toward more neutral topics like flowers and catering choices. After we hung up, I found myself reflecting on the persistent disconnect between how I saw my life and how my family interpreted it. From my perspective, I was building exactly the kind of life I wanted: professionally successful and personally content, with meaningful work and the freedom to make choices based on my own values rather than external expectations. From their perspective, I was a successful but incomplete person, someone who had achieved professional recognition but failed to check the boxes that really mattered in terms of personal fulfillment and social integration. The fact that I was happy with my choices seemed less important than the fact that my choices didn't align with their vision of what happiness should look like. The week before the wedding, I received an unexpected call from Trevor, Rachel's fiancé. We'd never had a one-on-one conversation, and I was surprised to see his name on my phone screen on a Tuesday evening. "Emma, hi, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time," he said, his voice carrying the slightly formal tone of someone who was making an effort to be friendly, despite not knowing me well. "I wanted to reach out because I saw the article about your consulting work, and I have to say, I was really impressed." I paused, unsure how to respond. "Thank you, Trevor. That's very kind of you to say." "Actually, I was hoping we might be able to grab coffee sometime after the wedding," he continued. "My family's company has been dealing with some operational challenges that sound very similar to the kinds of problems you specialize in solving. I'd love to pick your brain about potential approaches." The conversation that followed was the first time anyone in my extended family circle had engaged with my work as something valuable and relevant to their own professional needs. Trevor described challenges his family's construction business was facing with project coordination and resource allocation, problems that were costing them both time and money, while creating stress for employees who were trying to manage multiple projects simultaneously. His questions were intelligent and specific, demonstrating that he'd actually read and understood the article rather than just skimming it for general impressions. He wanted to know about my experience with construction industry clients, my approach to implementing new systems in established companies, and my thoughts on common pitfalls that businesses faced when trying to modernize their operations. For 20 minutes, I found myself having exactly the kind of conversation about my work that I'd been hoping for, but hadn't expected to have with someone from my personal life. Trevor understood the complexity of what I did, appreciated the value it could create, and treated my expertise with the respect it deserved. "I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous," he said as our conversation wound down, "but I think Rachel's family has really underestimated what you've accomplished." When I read that article, I kept thinking about the engagement party and how people were talking about your work like it was a hobby rather than a serious business. His observation was both validating and painful. It confirmed what I'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to acknowledge directly, that the dismissive attitudes I'd encountered weren't just my imagination or oversensitivity. Other people had noticed the disconnect between my actual achievements and how I was being treated by people who were supposed to know and support me. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. "It has been challenging sometimes, feeling like my choices aren't really understood or valued by people I care about." "Well, for what it's worth," Trevor said, "I think what you've built is impressive, and I'm excited to be marrying into a family that includes someone with your expertise and accomplishments." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling a complex mix of emotions. Trevor's call had provided the kind of professional recognition and personal validation I'd been missing from family interactions, but it also highlighted how isolated I'd been in dealing with the subtle dismissal and misunderstanding that characterized most of my relationships with relatives. The fact that my soon-to-be brother-in-law understood and appreciated my work in ways that my own parents and siblings didn't was both encouraging and deeply sad. It suggested that the problem wasn't with my choices or achievements, but with the narrow definitions of success and fulfillment that seemed to govern how my family evaluated personal and professional worth. As the wedding weekend approached, I found myself approaching it with a different mindset than I'd had at the engagement party. The article had created a public record of my accomplishments that couldn't be dismissed or minimized, and Trevor's response had demonstrated that at least some people in my expanded family circle were capable of recognizing and respecting what I'd built. I wasn't planning to make a big deal of the media coverage or use the wedding as an opportunity to correct people's misconceptions about my work. But I also wasn't planning to downplay my achievements or apologize for the choices I'd made. If conversations arose about my business, I would engage honestly and confidently, secure in the knowledge that my work had value regardless of whether everyone understood or appreciated it. The wedding venue was a historic mansion in Cherry Hills Village, with gardens that looked like something from a magazine and a ballroom that could accommodate 200 guests comfortably. Rachel had chosen spring flowers and soft lighting that created an atmosphere of elegant romanticism, exactly the kind of celebration that would photograph beautifully and create lasting memories for everyone involved. I arrived early, partially, because I'd learned that family events were easier to navigate when I had time to acclimate before the crowds arrived, and partially because I wanted to spend some time with Rachel before she became completely absorbed in wedding day logistics and excitement. She was in the bridal suite when I found her, surrounded by bridesmaids and family members, but still managing to radiate the kind of calm joy that suggested she was genuinely excited about marrying Trevor, rather than just excited about having a beautiful wedding. "Emma!" she called out when she saw me, crossing the room to give me a hug that was warm and genuine, despite the careful attention to preserving her hair and makeup. "I'm so glad you're here. You look beautiful." I was wearing a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, something elegant but not attention-grabbing, in a shade of blue that complemented the wedding colors without competing with the bridal party. I'd taken more care with my appearance than usual, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel confident and put together in what I knew would be a socially complex environment. "You look absolutely radiant," I told her, which was true. Rachel had always been beautiful, but there was something about her expression that day that was particularly lovely. A combination of happiness and certainty that made her glow in a way that had nothing to do with professional makeup or expensive dress. "Thank you," she said, then leaned in closer and lowered her voice. "Trevor told me he called you about the business stuff. I hope that was okay. He's been really excited about your article. Keeps showing it to people and talking about how smart you are." The comment caught me off guard, both because I hadn't expected Trevor to share our conversation with Rachel, and because the idea of someone being excited about my work and wanting to share it with others was so different from my usual family experience. "That's very flattering," I said. "I'm glad he found it interesting." "He said he wants to hire you," Rachel continued, smiling in a way that suggested she found this development amusing and positive. "He keeps talking about how much money you could save his family's company, and how impressed his father would be if Trevor brought in someone who could solve their project management problems." Before I could respond, one of the bridesmaids called Rachel over for a photo, and she squeezed my hand before moving away to pose with her friends. I stood there for a moment, processing what she'd shared, and wondering how much Trevor's enthusiasm might influence how other family members, particularly his parents, viewed my work and expertise. The ceremony was beautiful, held in the mansion's garden with the Colorado mountains providing a dramatic backdrop. Rachel and Trevor had written their own vows, which were personal but not overly intimate, striking exactly the right tone for a celebration that included both close family and professional acquaintances. As I watched them exchange rings and promise to build a life together, I found myself thinking about the different ways people created meaning and stability in their lives. Rachel had chosen the traditional path of partnership and shared goals, building her identity around relationship and family connections. I had chosen a more independent route, finding meaning through work and personal accomplishment. Neither approach was inherently better or worse, but the fact that only one of them was consistently celebrated and validated in our social circles revealed something important about the assumptions that shaped how we thought about success and fulfillment. The reception began with cocktails on the terrace, where guests mingled and enjoyed appetizers, while the bride and groom took photos with various family combinations. I found myself in conversations with cousins I saw only at weddings and funerals, updating each other on jobs and relationships and generally catching up on the kinds of life changes that accumulate between major family gatherings. Most of these conversations followed familiar patterns, with people sharing updates that were easy to understand and celebrate. Promotions, new houses, children's achievements in school or sports, vacation plans, and home improvement projects. When the conversation turned to me, I offered brief updates about my business that were accurate, but not detailed enough to require much explanation or follow-up questioning. But as the evening progressed, I noticed a subtle shift in how some people were engaging with me. Several relatives mentioned having seen or heard about the newspaper article, and their questions about my work were more informed and respectful than they had been at previous gatherings. My uncle Robert, who owned a small chain of hardware stores, asked specific questions about digital inventory management and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts on how small retailers could compete more effectively with big box stores and online retailers. My cousin Jennifer, who managed operations for a regional nonprofit, wanted to know about my experience helping organizations improve efficiency without compromising their mission or values. These conversations felt different from the polite but dismissive interactions I'd grown accustomed to at family events. People were engaging with my expertise rather than just making conversation, treating my work as something valuable and relevant to their own professional challenges rather than as an interesting but irrelevant curiosity. The shift was subtle, but significant, suggesting that public validation of my work had changed how at least some family members understood what I did and why it mattered. The newspaper article had provided context and credibility that my own descriptions of my business had never achieved, creating a framework for understanding my choices that made sense within their existing ideas about professional success and entrepreneurial achievement. As dinner was served and guests found their seats, I discovered I'd been placed at a table with Trevor's business associates and their spouses, rather than relegated to the family table where I usually sat during these kinds of events. The placement felt deliberate and respectful, acknowledging my professional status rather than just my family relationship to the bride. The conversation at dinner was lively and engaging, covering topics that ranged from local business development to industry trends in construction and real estate. I found myself contributing to discussions about regulatory changes, technology adoption, and workforce development challenges, topics that were directly relevant to my consulting work and where my perspective was valued and appreciated. For the first time at a family wedding, I felt like I was being seen and heard as the professional I actually was, rather than as the family member people thought I should become. The evening was turning into exactly the kind of validation I'd been hoping for but hadn't expected to receive, at least not so quickly or completely. As the dancing began and the formal dinner portion of the evening wound down, I stepped outside onto the terrace to get some air and process the unexpected turn the evening had taken. The article had accomplished something I hadn't fully anticipated, creating a ripple effect that was changing how people in my personal life understood and valued my work. Standing there in the mountain air, watching the celebration continue inside, I felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with finally being seen clearly by people who mattered to me. The validation felt earned rather than defensive, professional rather than personal, based on actual achievement rather than just wishful thinking or family loyalty. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to the conversations that would follow, curious about how this shift in perception might change my relationships with family members, and excited about the professional opportunities that seemed to be emerging from unexpected directions. The moment came during the father-daughter dance, when the music was soft and most of the guests had settled into their seats with coffee and wedding cake. I was standing near the edge of the dance floor, watching Rachel and our father move slowly to a song she'd chosen specifically for this moment, when Patricia Morrison approached me with a champagne flute in her hand and a smile that looked considerably warmer than it had at the engagement party. "Emma," she said, extending her hand in greeting as if we were meeting for the first time. "I've been hoping to catch you this evening. Trevor has told us so much about your consulting work, and frankly, I'm embarrassed that we didn't have a proper conversation about it when we met before." I accepted her handshake, noting the difference in her demeanor from our previous interaction. Where she had been politely dismissive at the engagement party, she now seemed genuinely interested in engaging with me as a professional equal rather than just Rachel's sister who needed to be acknowledged out of politeness. "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison," I replied. "I hope you're enjoying the celebration." "Oh, please, call me Patricia," she said, waving away the formality. "And yes, it's been a beautiful evening. But I have to tell you, I've been thinking about that article in the Denver Business Journal ever since Trevor showed it to us last week. Your approach to operational consulting sounds exactly like what our family business has been needing." The conversation that followed was unlike any interaction I'd had with Trevor's family at the engagement party. Patricia asked detailed questions about my experience with construction industry clients, my methods for analyzing workflow inefficiencies, and my track record helping family-owned businesses navigate growth challenges without losing their operational identity. Her questions demonstrated that she'd not only read the article thoroughly, but had also done additional research into my background and methodology. She mentioned specific details from client testimonials that had been included in the piece, and she referenced industry trends that connected to my areas of expertise in ways that showed genuine understanding, rather than polite curiosity. "Trevor's father and I have been discussing this," she said, lowering her voice slightly as the music continued around us. "Our company has been struggling with project coordination issues that are costing us both time and money. We've tried working with larger consulting firms, but they always want to implement massive system overhauls that don't really fit how we prefer to operate." I listened carefully, recognizing the challenges she described as typical of family businesses that had grown successful through personal relationships and established practices, but were finding that those same approaches created bottlenecks as they expanded their operations. "What kind of coordination issues are you experiencing?" I asked, genuinely curious about the specifics of their situation. Patricia's response was comprehensive and well-informed, describing communication breakdowns between project sites, inefficient resource allocation that led to equipment sitting idle while other projects faced delays, and scheduling conflicts that resulted from multiple managers making decisions independently without adequate information about company-wide commitments. These were exactly the kinds of complex, interconnected problems that I specialized in solving, challenges that required understanding both the technical aspects of project management and the human dynamics that determined whether new systems would be successfully adopted by existing teams. "The frustrating thing," Patricia continued, "is that we know these problems are solvable. We're not asking for miracles, just better coordination and communication systems. But the consulting firms we've worked with always want to reinvent everything from scratch instead of building on what already works well for us." Her description of previous consulting experiences resonated with complaints I'd heard from other clients who had been disappointed by cookie-cutter approaches that failed to account for the unique culture and operational strengths of their organizations. "That's actually one of the reasons I chose to work independently," I said. "I've found that most businesses don't need complete overhauls. They need targeted improvements that enhance their existing strengths while addressing specific pain points." "Exactly," Patricia said, her enthusiasm evident. "Trevor has been telling us that your approach is much more collaborative and customized than what we've experienced before. Would you be interested in having a more detailed conversation about our situation after you've had a chance to recover from wedding festivities?" The question was professionally phrased, but carried an undertone of genuine hope that surprised me. This was Trevor's mother, the woman who had dismissed my work as a hobby just months earlier, now actively seeking my professional services and treating me as a potential solution to significant business challenges. "I'd be very interested in learning more," I replied. "Why don't you have Trevor send me some basic information about your current challenges, and we can schedule a consultation to discuss whether my approach would be a good fit for your needs." As Patricia and I continued talking, I became aware that our conversation was attracting attention from other guests. Several people were standing nearby, obviously listening to our discussion about business consulting and operational efficiency, with the kind of interest that suggested they were facing similar challenges in their own organizations. My cousin, Brian, who had dismissed my work as computer stuff at the engagement party, approached during a lull in the music and inserted himself into our conversation with the casual confidence of someone who assumed he would be welcome. "Emma," he said, extending his hand toward Patricia in introduction. "I don't think we've met. I'm Brian Rodriguez, Emma's cousin. I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about consulting work." Patricia shook his hand politely, but her attention remained focused on me as Brian continued talking. "Emma's always been the smart one in the family," he said with the kind of condescending affection that made my jaw tighten. "We always knew she'd figure out how to make that computer background work for her eventually." The comment hung in the air awkwardly, revealing Brian's continued misunderstanding of my work while simultaneously attempting to claim credit for predicting success that he had actually dismissed just months earlier. Patricia's expression shifted slightly, becoming cooler and more formal as she processed Brian's words. "Actually," she said, her tone polite but firm, "Emma's expertise in operational consulting is exactly what our construction company has been looking for. Her approach to workflow optimization and system integration is quite sophisticated." Brian's smile faltered slightly as he realized that his attempt to position himself as knowledgeable about my work had backfired. Patricia's response made it clear that she understood my expertise better than he did, and that his characterization of my background was both inaccurate and inappropriate. "Oh, well, yes," Brian said, clearly trying to recover his footing. "I just meant that we're all proud of how she's built her business. Family support is so important for entrepreneurs." The irony of his comment was sharp enough that I had to concentrate on keeping my expression neutral. Family support had been notably absent during the years I'd been building my business, replaced instead by well-meaning suggestions that I consider more traditional career paths and gentle implications, that my choices were concerning rather than commendable. Patricia seemed to sense the undercurrent of tension in Brian's comments. "Well," she said, turning back to me with renewed focus, "I'm certainly glad we had the opportunity to discuss your work tonight. I'll have Trevor contact you next week to set up that consultation." As she moved away to rejoin her husband, Brian remained standing beside me, apparently unaware that his intervention had been anything other than helpfully supportive. "That seemed to go well," he said, smiling in a way that suggested he believed he had contributed positively to the interaction. "It's great that you're getting opportunities to work with established companies like theirs." I nodded non-committally, choosing not to explain that his interruption had actually undermined the professional tone Patricia and I had been maintaining. The conversation with Patricia had been progressing as a discussion between equals, two professionals exploring a potential business relationship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of complex challenges. Brian's comments had introduced an element of familial condescension that had shifted the dynamic, positioning me as someone whose work needed to be defended or explained, rather than someone whose expertise was inherently valuable and well-established. The difference was subtle, but significant, and it reminded me of the ongoing challenge of maintaining professional credibility within family contexts, where people's perceptions were shaped by outdated assumptions and persistent misunderstandings about the nature and value of my work. As the evening continued and guests began to move between the dance floor and conversation areas, I found myself in several more professional discussions that felt markedly different from typical family wedding interactions. Trevor's business associates asked thoughtful questions about digital transformation strategies, operational efficiency improvements, and the challenges facing small to medium-sized businesses in an increasingly complex regulatory environment. These conversations were intellectually stimulating and professionally rewarding in ways that family wedding discussions rarely were. Instead of making small talk about personal updates and social connections, I was engaging with people who understood the complexity of modern business operations and appreciated the specialized knowledge required to help organizations navigate technological and operational changes successfully. One of Trevor's colleagues, a commercial real estate developer named Michael Chen, described challenges his company was facing with project timeline coordination and wanted my perspective on whether technology solutions might help them manage multiple development projects more efficiently. Another guest, Sarah Kim, who owned a small chain of boutique hotels, had read about my work in the Business Journal article and was curious about my experience helping hospitality businesses improve their operational workflows while maintaining the personalized service that differentiated them from larger hotel chains. Each conversation reinforced my sense that the article had created opportunities for professional recognition and business development that extended well beyond what I had initially anticipated. People were approaching me as an expert rather than as a family member who happened to work in business consulting, and their questions reflected genuine interest in my perspective rather than polite curiosity about what I did for work. The most significant conversation of the evening came near the end of the reception, when Trevor's father, William Morrison, approached me as I was saying goodbye to other guests and preparing to leave. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in business contexts. "I understand you've been discussing our operational challenges with Patricia. I wanted to add my voice to hers in expressing our interest in exploring a consulting relationship with you." William Morrison was the kind of man who commanded attention when he entered a room, successful and confident in ways that came from decades of building and running a profitable business. His decision to seek me out personally, rather than delegating the conversation to Patricia or Trevor, suggested that he took the potential consulting relationship seriously and wanted to establish direct communication with me about his company's needs. "Trevor has been very enthusiastic about your work," he continued. "And frankly, after reading that Business Journal article and hearing Patricia's assessment of your conversation tonight, I'm convinced that you might be exactly what our company needs to solve some persistent coordination problems." The conversation that followed was the most substantive business discussion I'd had at a family event in my entire adult life. William described specific challenges his construction company was facing, including project delays caused by communication, breakdowns, cost overruns resulting from poor resource allocation, and client satisfaction issues that stemmed from inconsistent project management across different job sites. His questions about my methodology were detailed and informed, demonstrating that he had researched my background thoroughly and understood the value proposition I offered to businesses facing similar operational challenges. He wanted to know about my experience with construction industry clients, my approach to implementing new systems without disrupting successful aspects of existing operations, and my track record helping family-owned businesses maintain their competitive advantages while scaling their operations more efficiently. "The thing is," William said, lowering his voice as other guests continued their conversations around us, "we've tried working with some of the big consulting firms, and they always want to completely restructure how we operate. But our approach to customer relationships and quality control is what's made us successful. We don't want to change what works, we just want to fix what doesn't." His description of previous consulting experiences echoed complaints I'd heard from other family-owned businesses that had been frustrated by consultants who failed to understand the unique culture and operational strengths that had made them successful in the first place. "That's exactly the kind of challenge I most enjoy working on," I replied. "In my experience, most businesses don't need complete overhauls. They need targeted improvements that enhance their existing strengths while addressing specific operational pain points." William nodded approvingly. "That's precisely what we're looking for. Would you be available to visit our main office next week for a more comprehensive discussion about our situation? I'd like you to meet with our project managers and see our operations firsthand before we move forward with any formal consulting arrangement." The invitation was both professionally flattering and personally validating. William Morrison was treating me as a serious business consultant whose expertise could provide significant value to his company, not as his son's new sister-in-law who happened to work in a field that might be marginally relevant to his business needs. "I'd be very interested in learning more about your operations," I said. "Why don't you have Trevor coordinate with me to schedule a site visit and initial consultation?" As William and I shook hands to conclude our conversation, I was struck by the dramatic shift that had occurred over the course of the evening. I had arrived at the wedding as Rachel's sister who worked in consulting, someone whose professional achievements were interesting but not particularly relevant to the business-focused guests in attendance. I was leaving as Emma Rodriguez, operational consultant, someone whose expertise was actively sought by successful business owners who faced challenges that my specialized knowledge could help them solve. The transformation wasn't just about external recognition, though that was certainly satisfying after years of feeling professionally invisible at family gatherings. More importantly, It represented a fundamental shift in how I was positioned within my extended family network, from someone whose choices needed to be explained or defended to someone whose professional judgment was valued and respected. As I walked to my car through the mansion's gardens, I reflected on the series of conversations that had defined the evening. Patricia Morrison's enthusiastic interest in my consulting services, William Morrison's detailed questions about my methodology, and multiple other guests treating me as a professional resource, rather than just a family member who needed to be included in social conversations. The article in the Denver Business Journal had accomplished something I hadn't fully anticipated when I agreed to be interviewed. It had created a public record of my professional achievements that couldn't be dismissed or minimized, providing context that allowed people to understand the value and complexity of my work in ways that my own descriptions had never achieved. More significantly, the article had positioned me within a broader narrative about successful entrepreneurs and innovative business practices, creating a framework for understanding my choices that aligned with values my family and social network already respected and admired. The validation felt earned rather than accidental, based on documented achievements and measurable results, rather than just good intentions or family loyalty. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to family gatherings and professional networking opportunities, curious about how this shift in perception might create new possibilities for both my business and my personal relationships. Driving home through the quiet Denver streets, I felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with finally being seen clearly by people whose opinions mattered to me. The evening had demonstrated that my professional achievements were substantial enough to command respect from successful business owners, and that my expertise was valuable enough to generate genuine interest from potential clients. The shift represented more than just business development opportunities, though those were certainly welcome. It represented a fundamental change in how I existed within my family and social network, from someone whose choices were concerning to someone whose success was admirable and whose professional judgment was worth seeking out. As I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage, I was already thinking about the consultation with Morrison Construction and the other business opportunities that seemed to be emerging from unexpected directions. The evening had created momentum that felt both exciting and sustainable, based on actual expertise rather than just wishful thinking or social connections. For the first time in years, I was approaching my professional future with confidence that was grounded in external validation as well as personal satisfaction, secure in the knowledge that my work had value that extended well beyond my own assessment of its worth. The consultation with Morrison Construction took place on a crisp Thursday morning in October, 6 weeks after Rachel's wedding. Their headquarters occupied a renovated warehouse in the River North Arts District, with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting that created an atmosphere of functional sophistication. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit with new clients, using the extra time to observe the office environment and get a sense of the company culture before formal introductions began. The reception area displayed photographs of completed projects spanning 3 decades, from small residential renovations to major commercial developments. Awards and industry certifications lined one wall, while another featured a timeline showing the company's growth from a 2-person operation founded by William's father to the 50-employee business it had become under William's leadership. William appeared precisely on time, accompanied by his operations manager, Janet Torres, and his head project coordinator, Mike Sullivan. The introductions were professional but warm, with none of the social awkwardness that had characterized my early interactions with Trevor's family at the engagement party. "Emma, thank you for making time for us," William said as he led me toward their conference room. "We're genuinely excited about the possibility of working with you." After our conversation at the wedding, Patricia and I spent considerable time discussing our operational challenges, and we both believe your approach could make a significant difference for our company. The next 2 hours exceeded my expectations in every possible way. William, Janet, and Mike had prepared thoroughly for our meeting, providing detailed documentation of their current processes, clear explanations of specific problems they were hoping to solve, and realistic timelines for implementing improvements without disrupting ongoing projects. Janet walked me through their project management workflow, highlighting bottlenecks that were causing delays and coordination failures that were affecting both client satisfaction and employee morale. Mike explained their resource allocation challenges, describing how poor communication between job sites was leading to equipment sitting idle while other projects faced unnecessary delays. Their problems were exactly the kind of complex, interconnected challenges I specialized in addressing. But what impressed me most was their sophisticated understanding of their own organizational strengths and limitations. They weren't looking for a consultant to tell them what was wrong with their business. They were looking for someone who could help them optimize systems that were fundamentally sound, but operationally inefficient. The frustrating thing, Janet explained, is that we know these problems are solvable. We're not dealing with fundamental business model issues or competitive threats. We just need better coordination and communication systems that work with how we actually operate, rather than requiring us to completely change our company culture. By the end of our meeting, we had outlined a 6-month consulting engagement that would address their most pressing operational challenges while building internal capacity for ongoing system improvements. The project scope was substantial, the timeline was realistic, and the fee structure reflected the significant value I would be providing to their organization. More importantly, the entire interaction had been characterized by mutual respect and professional equality. William, Janet, and Mike treated me as an expert whose insights could genuinely improve their business operations, not as a favor to Trevor or an experiment in working with unconventional consultants. As I drove home from their office, I reflected on how dramatically my professional relationships had shifted since the Business Journal article was published. The Morrison construction engagement represented exactly the kind of meaningful, well-compensated work I had been building toward for years, but it had materialized through family connections that had previously been sources of professional frustration rather than business development opportunities. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same family network that had dismissed my work as a hobby was now generating some of the most significant consulting opportunities I'd ever encountered. The difference wasn't in my expertise or capabilities, which had been developing steadily for years, but in the external validation that allowed people to recognize and appreciate work they had previously been unable to understand or categorize. 2 weeks into the Morrison construction project, I received a call from my mother that surprised me with its tone and content. Instead of the usual mixture of concern and subtle disappointment that characterized most of our conversations about my career, she sounded genuinely excited and proud. "Emma, honey, I just had the most interesting conversation with Patricia Morrison," she said, her voice carrying an enthusiasm I hadn't heard when she talked about my work in years. She called to thank me for raising such a brilliant daughter and to tell me how impressed William has been with your analysis of their business operations. The conversation that followed was unlike any discussion my mother and I had ever had about my professional life. Instead of expressing concern about my unconventional career path or suggesting that I consider more traditional employment options, she was asking detailed questions about my work with Morrison Construction and sharing Patricia's glowing reports about my consulting methodology. "Patricia says you identified problems they didn't even realize they had," my mother continued, "and that your recommendations are already saving them thousands of dollars in wasted time and resources. She told me that William is calling you the best investment they've made in years." The validation was gratifying, but what struck me most was the shift in my mother's tone and approach to discussing my career. For the first time, she was talking about my work with pride rather than concern, treating my professional achievements as accomplishments to celebrate rather than decisions that needed to be defended or explained. "I have to admit," she said, her voice becoming more reflective, "I never really understood what you were building with your consulting business. I knew you were smart and capable, but I worried that you were making things harder for yourself by choosing such an unconventional path." Her honesty was both painful and relieving. It confirmed what I had suspected, but hadn't wanted to acknowledge directly, that her concerns about my career choices had been genuine rather than just social politeness, and that her previous lack of enthusiasm had reflected real worry about my professional prospects, rather than simple misunderstanding. "But seeing how respected you are by people like the Morrisons," she continued, "and reading about your work in that business journal article, I realize that you've built something really impressive. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you were accomplishing." The apology was unexpected and deeply meaningful. It represented not just recognition of my professional achievements, but acknowledgement that her previous responses to my career choices had been based on incomplete understanding rather than accurate assessment of my capabilities and prospects. As autumn progressed into winter, the momentum generated by the Morrison construction project and the Business Journal article continued to accelerate in ways I hadn't anticipated. Word of my work with Williams' company spread through Denver's business community, generating inquiries from other construction firms, real estate developers, and small manufacturers who were facing similar operational challenges. The referrals came through professional networks rather than social connections, based on documented results rather than family relationships. Potential clients were contacting me because they had heard about measurable improvements I'd helped other businesses achieve, not because someone had suggested they talk to me out of politeness or family obligation. Within 6 months, I had expanded from working with individual clients on specific projects to managing multiple ongoing consulting relationships with businesses across several industries. The work was intellectually challenging, financially rewarding, and professionally satisfying in ways that exceeded anything I'd experienced during my corporate career. More significantly, the shift in external recognition had created space for more authentic relationships with family members who had previously struggled to understand or appreciate my career choices. Conversations at family gatherings began to focus on my expertise and achievements rather than concerns about my unconventional path or gentle suggestions about alternative career directions. Rachel, who had always been supportive but hadn't really understood what I did professionally, became one of my most enthusiastic advocates, regularly referring friends and acquaintances who were dealing with business challenges that aligned with my areas of expertise. "I'm so proud of what you've built," she told me during one of our regular coffee meetings, "and I'm embarrassed that it took Trevor's family recognizing your work before I really understood how successful you've become." Her acknowledgement meant more to me than professional recognition from strangers, representing the kind of family support and understanding I had hoped for, but hadn't experienced during the years I'd been building my business. Even Brian, who had consistently dismissed my work as computer stuff and had awkwardly attempted to take credit for my success at the wedding, began approaching me with genuine respect for my professional accomplishments and occasional requests for business advice related to his own marketing firm. The transformation in family dynamics was gradual but comprehensive, shifting from a pattern where my career choices needed to be defended or explained to one where my professional judgment was valued and my business insights were actively sought out. By the first anniversary of the Business Journal article, I had established myself as one of Denver's recognized experts in operational consulting for small to medium-sized businesses. I was regularly invited to speak at industry conferences, quoted in local business publications, and sought out by entrepreneurs who were facing the kinds of growth challenges I specialized in addressing. The success felt earned rather than accidental, built on years of developing expertise and establishing client relationships rather than sudden recognition or external validation. But the article had provided the context and credibility that allowed people to understand and appreciate work that had previously been invisible or misunderstood. More importantly, the shift in external recognition had created space for me to exist authentically within my family and social networks, without the constant pressure to justify my choices or apologize for pursuing a path that didn't align with traditional expectations about career progression and professional success. The office I eventually rented in downtown Denver reflected the kind of understated professionalism that characterized my approach to business development. Clean lines, neutral colors, and furniture that served its purpose without demanding attention. But the view was spectacular, overlooking the mountains that had provided the backdrop for Rachel's wedding, and the family relationships that had finally evolved to include genuine understanding and appreciation of my work. My assistant, Jennifer Martinez, whom I'd hired to manage scheduling and client communications as my business continued to grow, often commented on how different my approach was from other consultants she'd worked with in previous positions. Most consultants I've known were always trying to prove how smart they were, she told me one afternoon as we reviewed project timelines and client deliverables. But you're more focused on actually solving problems than on getting credit for solving them. Her observation captured something essential about the approach that had made my business successful and sustainable. I wasn't interested in being the loudest voice in the room or the most impressive presenter at networking events. I was interested in delivering results that made a genuine difference for clients who trusted me with their operational challenges and business development goals. The work itself remained intellectually satisfying and personally meaningful, but the context had shifted dramatically. Instead of existing in isolation, building expertise that was valuable but largely invisible, I was now part of a professional community that understood and appreciated the complexity of what I did. The financial success had exceeded my projections, allowing me to invest in additional training and technology that enhanced my ability to serve clients effectively. But more importantly, the recognition had created opportunities for the kind of challenging, high-impact projects that utilized my full range of capabilities and experience. The most rewarding project of my second year came from an unexpected source: a nonprofit organization that provided job training and placement services for adults transitioning out of homelessness. Their operations director, Maria Santos, had heard about my work through a presentation I'd given at a conference on sustainable business practices. The challenges they faced were complex and emotionally significant, involving systems that affected real people's ability to rebuild their lives and achieve economic stability. The work required not just technical expertise in operational efficiency, but deep understanding of the human factors that determined whether training programs succeeded or failed. Over 8 months, we redesigned their intake process, improved coordination between training programs and job placement services, and implemented systems that allowed them to serve 30% more clients with the same staffing levels. The improvements resulted in higher completion rates for training programs and better employment outcomes for program participants. The project reminded me why I had chosen consulting over traditional employment in the first place. The work allowed me to apply my expertise to challenges that mattered, creating value that extended well beyond financial metrics to include real improvements in people's lives and opportunities. Standing in my office on a December afternoon, looking out over the Denver skyline as snow began to fall, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 5 years earlier, I had walked away from a secure corporate job to build something that felt authentic and meaningful, despite widespread skepticism from family members who worried about my unconventional choices. The path had been challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated, not just financially and professionally, but emotionally and socially. Building a successful consulting practice required not just technical expertise and business development skills, but the emotional resilience to persist despite persistent misunderstanding and occasional dismissal from people whose opinions mattered to me personally. But the outcome had exceeded my most optimistic projections, creating professional opportunities and personal satisfaction that wouldn't have been possible within traditional employment structures. I had built something that was entirely my own, based on my values and priorities, rather than external expectations about what success should look like. More importantly, the journey had taught me that authentic success often requires patience and persistence through periods when your work is invisible or misunderstood by people who matter to you personally. The validation, when it came, was more meaningful because it was based on actual achievement rather than just good intentions or family loyalty. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel asking if I was free for dinner to celebrate her 3-month pregnancy announcement. The invitation represented the kind of family relationship I had always hoped for, but hadn't experienced during the years when my career choices created tension and misunderstanding. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave the office, I thought about the advice I would give to someone facing similar challenges. Someone whose work was valuable but misunderstood, whose choices were concerning to people who loved them, but couldn't understand their vision. The answer, I realized, wasn't to change course or apologize for pursuing meaningful work that didn't fit traditional expectations. The answer was to persist with integrity and confidence, building something worthy of recognition while remaining patient with people who needed time and context to understand what you were creating. Recognition, when it comes, is more satisfying when it's based on substance rather than explanation, on results rather than good intentions, on external validation rather than defensive justification. Most importantly, the work itself has to be worth doing regardless of whether other people understand or appreciate it immediately. The satisfaction has to come from the work itself, from the problems you're solving and the value you're creating, rather than from external recognition or family approval. As I walked to my car through the December snow, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path I had chosen and the persistence that had allowed me to build something meaningful, despite initial skepticism and ongoing challenges. The recognition had been gratifying, but the real reward was the work itself and the knowledge that I had created something authentic and valuable on my own terms. The evening ahead promised conversation with family members who now understood and appreciated what I had built, but even more importantly, it promised the continuation of work that remained intellectually challenging and personally meaningful, regardless of external recognition or family approval. That, I realized, was the real measure of success. Building something you believe in deeply enough to persist through periods of misunderstanding, while remaining open to the possibility that recognition and appreciation will eventually follow when the work speaks for itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.